A dog left alone in a quiet, comfortable room with adequate food, water, and physical safety will typically settle into a state of relaxed rest. A human being left alone in the same quiet, comfortable room with the same adequate food, water, and physical safety will typically begin, within a surprisingly short period of time, to experience a specific and distinctly unpleasant psychological state, a restless, dissatisfied, agitated sense that something is wrong, that time is passing too slowly, that the present moment urgently needs to be filled with something other than what is currently occupying it. This is boredom, and despite how mundane and universal the experience feels, it turns out to be one of the more theoretically puzzling and evolutionarily distinctive emotional states available to human beings. The question of whether other animals experience anything resembling human boredom has been a genuinely difficult one for comparative psychologists to answer with confidence, but the emerging consensus points toward boredom, at least in its full, distinctively human form, being either unique to our species or present in only a small number of other species with unusually sophisticated cognitive capacities, and even in those cases, likely present in a considerably simpler and less psychologically consequential form than the human experience. Understanding why boredom exists, what specific cognitive machinery it depends on, and why it appears to require a level of psychological sophistication that most of the animal kingdom simply does not possess, illuminates something important about the underlying architecture of human consciousness and its relationship to time, attention, and meaning. Let's begin with the theoretical framework that has done the most to establish a rigorous scientific definition of boredom. The psychologist John Eastwood at York University, whose research on boredom has become foundational to the modern scientific study of the emotion, proposed in an influential 2012 paper what has become the most widely accepted psychological definition of boredom: the aversive experience of wanting, but being unable, to engage in satisfying activity, a definition that specifically identifies boredom not simply as the absence of stimulation, but as a specific and active mismatch between a person's desire for meaningful engagement and their inability, for whatever reason, to achieve that engagement in their current circumstances. This definition is theoretically significant because it distinguishes boredom sharply from simple understimulation or inactivity. A person can be completely inactive, sitting quietly with no external stimulation whatsoever, without experiencing boredom, provided they are engaged in some internally satisfying activity, such as reflective thought, meditation, or simply a state of restful contentment. Conversely, a person can be surrounded by an abundance of external stimulation, including stimulation that would ordinarily be considered engaging, and still experience acute boredom if that stimulation fails to connect with their current motivational state, or fails to provide the specific kind of meaningful engagement their attention is seeking. Eastwood's research proposes that this specific mismatch, wanting engagement but being unable to achieve it, requires several distinct cognitive capacities operating in coordination: the capacity to hold and represent a desired state, specifically meaningful engagement, that differs from one's current actual state, the capacity to monitor the ongoing gap between this desired state and the actual present experience, and critically, the capacity to attribute this gap to something more than simple external circumstances, generating the specifically self-referential and agentive quality of boredom, the sense that one's own attention and engagement have failed to connect with the world in a way that feels like it should be within one's own capacity to correct. This last requirement, the self-referential and agentive quality of boredom, connects directly to why boredom appears to require a level of cognitive sophistication that most non-human animals likely do not possess. The comparative psychologist and boredom researcher Andreas Elpidorou at the University of Louisville has proposed that genuine boredom, as opposed to the simpler forms of understimulation-related restlessness that can be documented behaviorally in some other species, requires what he calls metacognitive awareness of one's own attentional state. The capacity not simply to be understimulated, but to represent to oneself, at some level of conscious awareness, that one is understimulated, and that this understimulation constitutes an aversive and specifically unsatisfying condition relative to some implicit standard of how engaged one's attention ought to be. Elpidorou's theoretical account connects boredom to the broader capacity for metacognition, the ability to think about and monitor one's own mental states, that has been documented in only a small number of non-human species, most convincingly in some great apes, and a small number of other highly cognitively sophisticated species, including certain corvids and cetaceans. And even in these cases, the evidence for the specific and sophisticated form of self-referential temporal and motivational monitoring that human boredom appears to require remains considerably weaker and more contested than the evidence for simpler forms of metacognition, such as uncertainty monitoring. There is a further dimension of this research that deserves careful attention because it addresses an important empirical question that the purely theoretical account of boredom's cognitive requirements cannot resolve on its own: what the available comparative behavioral evidence actually shows about understimulation and restlessness in non-human species, and how researchers have attempted to distinguish genuine boredom from simpler forms of behavioral distress. The animal welfare researcher Francoise Wemelsfelder at Scotland's Rural College has conducted extensive research examining stereotypic behavior in captive and farmed animals, including repetitive pacing, self-directed grooming beyond what is functionally necessary, and other repetitive behavioral patterns that emerge reliably in animals housed in understimulating captive environments. Wemelsfelder's research proposes that these stereotypic behaviors represent behavioral evidence consistent with some form of aversive understimulation experience, though her research has been notably cautious about characterizing this experience as equivalent to human boredom specifically, given the significant methodological difficulty of establishing whether the animals in question possess the specific metacognitive self-awareness that Eastwood and Elpidorou's theoretical framework identifies as central to the human experience, as opposed to a simpler, non-self-referential form of behavioral and physiological dysregulation produced by prolonged environmental monotony. This methodological caution has been echoed and extended by the comparative cognition researcher Nicola Clayton at the University of Cambridge, whose extensive research on corvid cognition, conducted primarily with scrub jays and other members of the crow family, has documented behavioral evidence that these birds actively seek out novel stimulation and show clear behavioral preferences for varied over repetitive environments, a pattern of behavior that is at minimum consistent with some functional analog of boredom, understood as an aversive response to insufficient novelty, even though Clayton's research has been careful to note that behavioral preference for novelty does not, by itself, establish that the underlying subjective experience involves the specific kind of self-referential temporal monitoring that characterizes the human case. Clayton's broader research program on corvid cognition, which has independently established that scrub jays possess forms of episodic-like memory and future planning capacity that were previously thought to be uniquely human, has made corvids a particularly interesting test case for questions about the evolutionary distribution of sophisticated cognitive capacities more generally. And her research group's ongoing work, specifically investigating boredom-like states in these birds, represents one of the most methodologically careful attempts available to determine whether the specific cognitive architecture that human boredom appears to require might have evolved independently, through convergent evolution, in a lineage as evolutionarily distant from primates as birds. The challenge that Wemelsfelder's, Clayton's, and other comparative researchers' work collectively illustrates is a specific and quite general problem in comparative psychology. Behavioral evidence of understimulation-related distress, including stereotypic behavior and preference for novel stimulation, can be documented with reasonable confidence across a considerably wider range of species than the specific metacognitive, self-referential experience that the leading theoretical accounts of human boredom propose as its defining feature. This gap between observable behavior and the underlying subjective experience it may or may not reflect represents one of the most persistent methodological challenges in the comparative study of boredom specifically, and in the comparative study of subjective emotional experience more generally. The relationship between boredom and the human sense of time has been examined extensively by the psychologist James Danckert at the University of Waterloo, whose research program on boredom has documented that boredom is reliably associated with a specific and measurable distortion in the subjective experience of time passage, with bored individuals consistently and significantly overestimating how much objective clock time has actually elapsed during a boring interval, a distortion that does not occur, or occurs to a much smaller degree, during comparably unstimulating but non-boring experiences, such as restful relaxation. Danckert's research proposes that this specific temporal distortion connects to the underlying attentional mechanics of boredom, because boredom involves a persistent, effortful, and ultimately unsuccessful attempt to engage attention with the present moment. This repeated attentional effort generates a kind of internal monitoring signal that gets misattributed to the passage of time itself, producing the characteristic subjective sense that boring time passes unusually slowly, a phenomenon that requires exactly the kind of sophisticated temporal self-monitoring that Eastwood and Elpidorou's broader theoretical framework identifies as central to the boredom experience. The evolutionary question of why human beings would have evolved a capacity for an emotional state that is, by definition, aversive and psychologically costly to experience has been addressed by the psychologist Heather Lench at Texas A&M University, whose broader research on the functional significance of specific emotions has extended to propose that boredom, like other aversive emotional states including fear and disgust, likely serves an important adaptive signaling function despite its unpleasant subjective character. Lench's theoretical account proposes that boredom functions specifically as a signal that current behavior has become insufficiently productive or insufficiently novel to continue justifying the ongoing allocation of attention and effort, motivating exploratory behavior and the pursuit of new sources of information, stimulation, or productive activity that might yield a better return on the individual's limited cognitive and temporal resources than continuing the current, insufficiently engaging activity. This account connects boredom directly to the broader evolutionary psychology of exploration versus exploitation that we have examined in earlier videos in this series, including in the context of human childhood and play. On this account, boredom functions as a specific motivational signal calibrated to detect situations in which an organism's current behavioral strategy has become an inefficient use of its cognitive resources, prompting a shift toward exploratory behavior that, over the long run of an organism's behavioral history, would be expected to yield better outcomes than persisting indefinitely with an unproductive or insufficiently stimulating activity. The specific cognitive sophistication this account requires helps explain why boredom, in its full human form, appears to be evolutionarily rare, detecting that a current activity has become insufficiently novel or insufficiently productive requires not simply noticing an absence of stimulation, but comparing the current level of engagement against an internally represented standard of how engaging an activity ought to be. A standard that itself must be constructed and updated based on a sophisticated and temporally extended model of what kinds of activity have historically proven engaging or productive for the specific individual in question, a cognitive requirement that plausibly exceeds the cognitive architecture available to the vast majority of non-human species. The developmental psychologist Teresa Belton, whose research on childhood boredom has documented the developmental trajectory of this capacity, has found that the specific, self-referential experience of boredom that adults report does not appear in clearly recognizable form until relatively late in childhood development, with younger children showing behavioral signs of simple restlessness and understimulation considerably earlier than they show evidence of the specifically self-referential, metacognitively sophisticated experience that characterizes adult boredom, a developmental pattern consistent with the broader theoretical account connecting boredom to relatively sophisticated and relatively late developing metacognitive capacities. Belton's research has also documented a finding of considerable practical and educational significance. Children who experience boredom, rather than being immediately provided with external stimulation to relieve it, and who are instead given the space and support to independently resolve their own boredom through self-generated activity, show measurably greater subsequent creativity and self-directed problem-solving capacity than children whose boredom is habitually and immediately resolved through external intervention, suggesting that boredom, uncomfortable as it is, may serve an important developmental function, specifically in building the capacity for self-directed engagement and creative problem-solving that becomes increasingly important across the lifespan. There is one further dimension of this research worth examining, because it addresses a specific and clinically significant question that connects the basic science of boredom to real-world psychological outcomes. What happens when the capacity for boredom becomes chronically and severely dysregulated, either through excessive frequency and intensity or through an impaired capacity to resolve it through self-directed engagement? The psychologist Wijnand van Tilburg at the University of Essex has conducted extensive research documenting that chronic, trait-level boredom proneness, a stable individual difference in how frequently and how intensely a person experiences boredom across a wide range of situations, is robustly associated with a range of negative psychological and behavioral outcomes, including elevated rates of depression, elevated rates of risk-taking and sensation-seeking behavior including substance use, and in some populations, elevated rates of academic and occupational disengagement. Van Tilburg's research proposes that chronically high boredom proneness reflects a specific and measurable deficit in what he calls attentional and motivational self-regulation, an impaired capacity to either successfully engage attention with available activities or to successfully generate and pursue self-directed alternative activities when available options fail to provide sufficient engagement, leaving the individual persistently trapped in the specific aversive gap between wanting engagement and being unable to achieve it, that Eastwood's foundational definition identifies as the core of the boredom experience. Van Tilburg's research has also documented an important and somewhat counterintuitive finding regarding the relationship between boredom and meaning. Individuals experiencing acute boredom show a measurable and reliable increase in subsequent meaning-seeking behavior, including increased engagement with nostalgic reflection, connecting directly to the research on nostalgia's psychological function that we examined in an earlier video in this series, and increased prosocial behavior and charitable giving, suggesting that boredom, beyond its role in motivating simple novelty-seeking, may function as a more general signal, prompting a search for activities and experiences specifically connected to deeper existential meaning rather than simply any available source of stimulation. This meaning-seeking function of boredom has been examined further by the psychologist Shane Bench at Utah State University, whose research proposes an integrative account in which boredom serves as what he calls a regulatory signal specifically calibrated to detect not simply insufficient stimulation in a general sense, but the specific mismatch between an individual's current activity and their broader sense of what activities are genuinely meaningful and valuable to them, distinguishing boredom's functional signal from the simpler forms of restlessness that might be produced by mere sensory monotony without this deeper motivational component. Bench's research found that boredom experienced during activities that are objectively low in sensory stimulation, but that a person considers personally meaningful, such as certain forms of contemplative or spiritual practice, occurs with measurably lower frequency and intensity than boredom experienced during activities of equivalent sensory monotony that lack this personal significance, supporting the broader theoretical account in which boredom tracks a specifically motivational and meaning-related mismatch rather than simple sensory understimulation considered in isolation. This meaning-tracking function of boredom connects back to why the capacity appears so evolutionarily rare and so cognitively demanding, detecting a mismatch not simply between stimulation and understimulation, but between an activity and a person's own extended, internally represented sense of what matters to them requires exactly the kind of sophisticated, temporally extended self-model that the comparative research on corvids, cetaceans, and great apes suggests is present, at best, in only a small handful of species beyond our own, and likely in a considerably simpler form even among those exceptions. What emerges from this substantial and still rapidly developing body of research is a picture of boredom not as a simple deficiency state, the mere absence of external stimulation, but as a sophisticated psychological signal that requires a level of metacognitive self-monitoring, temporal awareness, and internally represented standards of meaningful engagement that appears to be substantially unique to the human species, or at minimum present only in significantly simpler form among the small number of other species that show any evidence of comparable cognitive sophistication. The restless, agitated discomfort you feel in a boring moment is not a sign that something has gone wrong with your mind. It is a sign that your mind possesses a specific and evolutionarily rare capacity, the ability to notice, at the level of conscious, self-referential awareness, that your own engagement with the present moment has fallen short of what you are implicitly capable of, and to translate that noticing into a motivational pressure toward finding something better. No dog resting quietly in an empty room experiences this particular species of discomfort, not because a dog's life is somehow richer or more contented than a bored human's, but because a dog's mind, however capable it may be in other respects, does not appear to possess the specific reflective architecture required to generate the demand that boredom places on you, the demand to notice that the present moment is not enough, and to do something about it. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.